Welcome to Lo-Fi Stories. I'm Harry, your quiet guide for tonight's mystery. Before we begin, take a deep breath, and tell me where in the world are you listening from tonight? Let's begin. The case that made Sherlock famous. Chapter 1, The Letter That Wasn't Addressed. It began not with a knock, but with silence. A letter arrived at 221B Baker Street, no seal, no sender, not even a name. Just a single sheet folded inside an aged, cracked envelope, carrying only 6 haunting words. You owe him more than justice. Watson noticed it first on the breakfast table, placed precisely between the sugar bowl and the day's paper, as if it had been there all along. Sherlock Holmes, usually unbothered by the daily tide of correspondence, paused. His eyes narrowed, not in curiosity, but in recollection. This handwriting, he muttered, almost to himself. I've seen it once. 15 years ago. Before anyone cared who I was. Watson, spoon hovering in midair, asked cautiously, does this have to do with? But Holmes had already risen. No time for breakfast today, Watson, he said, retrieving his coat. We're going to Blackridge Abbey. Blackridge? That place has been abandoned for years. Exactly, Holmes said grimly. That's where it began. And where, perhaps, it should have ended. Chapter 2, Echoes at Blackridge Abbey. The road to Blackridge Abbey stretched like a ribbon of dust across the moors, wrapped in fog and framed by gnarled trees that whispered with every passing breeze. The place had not changed in over a decade, at least not from the outside. The stone arch still bore the faded family crest of the Belmores, long since extinct, and the once majestic windows stared blankly like dead eyes. Holmes said little during the ride. Watson watched him, his face unreadable, yet not cold. There was something else in his silence today. Not calculation, but memory. They reached the abbey just before noon. The caretaker, an old man named Callum, was waiting by the iron gate. His hands trembled as he lit his pipe, not from age, but unease. You were here once before, weren't you? Callum asked Holmes, voice like a creaking door. Yes, Holmes replied softly. But not as the man they now think I am. Callum opened the gate without another word. The gravel crunched underfoot as they approached the east wing, the side that had burned all those years ago. Ivy had claimed most of the facade, but the scorched outline of a once grand window still lingered like a ghost. Inside, dust reigned where elegance once lived. The grand hallway was a corridor of decay, torn velvet drapes, warped wood, and portraits eaten by time. But the scent was unmistakable. Old smoke, varnish, and something else. Blood memory. Holmes stopped before the charred stairwell. It happened here, he said. Watson hesitated. What exactly happened here, Holmes? Holmes turned, his expression darker than Watson had seen in years. The death of a boy. The ruin of a name. And the beginning of a legend built on a lie. Watson stared. You mean, your first case? Holmes nodded. But everyone says it was the Darlington poisoner. That's what made you famous. Holmes looked away. Yes, he whispered. Everyone says that. But deep in his voice was something Watson had never heard before. Doubt. Chapter 3, The Boy in the Window. The east wing of Blackridge Abbey had long since been sealed. Yet as Holmes and Watson stood before the iron-braced door, a key, old and bronze, drawn from the folds of Holmes's coat, slipped perfectly into place. The air that greeted them was dense. It hadn't been disturbed in years. Sunlight filtered weakly through broken glass and gauzy webs, casting strange shadows on the cracked marble floor. The scent of mold mingled with a faint trace of ash. Holmes stepped inside first. His footfalls were almost reverent. "This," he said quietly, "was once a music room. Lord Belmore had it built for his youngest son. A boy with no title. Just talent. A violinist." Watson moved beside him, his eyes drawn to a warped, broken instrument stand in the corner. "You knew the family?" Holmes didn't answer directly. "Only the boy," he said. "He used to sit in that window each morning, playing to the crows. He played, beautifully." There was something hollow in Holmes's tone. It wasn't nostalgia, it was grief, pressed into silence. Watson placed a hand on the windowsill. Burn marks crept up the wall. Holmes followed them with his eyes. "The fire started at midnight," he said. "They claimed it was an accident. That the boy, Daniel, knocked over an oil lamp. But I never believed that." Watson turned. "Then what did you believe?" Holmes stared out the broken window. Beyond it lay the skeletal remains of the old greenhouse, blackened by flame. "I believed someone wanted him gone. And that he stopped himself. A rare thing, for Sherlock Holmes to stop." Watson didn't press him. The silence said enough. Then something unexpected happened. A soft creak echoed through the hallway behind them. Not the groan of old wood, but the deliberate press of weight on floorboards. They weren't alone. Holmes raised a finger, motioning Watson to stillness. Another sound. A faint click. Holmes moved swiftly, stepping back into the corridor. "Who's there?" he called. No answer. Only a scrap of cloth, navy blue, caught on the edge of a rusted door hinge. Holmes pulled it free. "Wool," he muttered. "Not from decades ago. This was torn recently." Watson frowned. "Someone doesn't want you asking questions." Holmes nodded. "And yet, someone opened the door for us." Chapter 4, The One Who Watches. Holmes and Watson stood silently in the cold hall of Blackridge Abbey. The light from Watson's lantern trembled slightly, though not from the wind. The cloth in Holmes's hand was no longer just a clue. It was a presence. "This building," Holmes whispered, "is watched." Watson scanned the dark with caution. "By whom?" Holmes didn't respond at once. He walked toward the central corridor where the burned wallpaper curled like dead leaves. A once grand portrait at the end of the hallway had been slashed across the face, razor-sharp cuts through the canvas. The figure depicted was a boy holding a violin. "Daniel Belmore," Holmes said, gently brushing the corner of the torn painting. "I never told you how I met him." Watson waited, sensing the story now rising like a tide. "He was 12. I was 18. Mycroft had just begun work at the Foreign Office, and I was drifting. Restless. Unfocused. Our mother thought I needed purpose. So she sent me to stay with an old governess near this very estate. Said the country air might settle my thoughts." He allowed a dry smile, one that never reached his eyes. "Instead, I found Daniel. Curious, bright. And utterly miserable. No one paid him any attention. He was the late lord's illegitimate son, hidden away, clothed but ignored." Holmes stepped toward a doorway. "And then he vanished. Just days after I left." Watson frowned. "You think the fire was meant to cover something?" "I know it." The floor beneath them groaned. Then, above, footsteps. Holmes immediately doused the lantern. In pitch darkness, only the faint glow of moonlight filtered through the shattered stained glass. "Second floor," he murmured. "East corner." They climbed the stairs without speaking. Each tread creaked as if protesting their presence. At the top, they found the guest rooms, once reserved for artists, traveling scholars, and those the Belmores entertained in their more generous days. Now, they were ghosts of their former selves. Shattered frames, torn curtains, dust so thick it held the memory of long-gone footsteps. Until the final door on the left. It was clean. No dust. No cobwebs. The air had been disturbed. Holmes opened it slowly. Inside was a small chamber, scarcely lit, but in the corner, facing the window, stood a chair. A rocking chair. And in it, a single candle burned low. No one sat there now. But someone had, recently. Watson stepped closer. Someone's been watching this place. Holmes crouched beside the chair and touched the small table beside it. A teacup, warm. A journal, written in a tight, precise hand. And a page marked with a pressed violet. Holmes turned the page. His own name was written at the top. Sherlock Holmes, if you are reading this, then the game has begun again. Watson leaned in. Is it a warning? Holmes shook his head. A challenge. Chapter 5, The Journal of Shadows. Watson watched as Holmes carefully lifted the journal from the dustless table. The candle flickered beside him, casting an amber halo around the name inked on the open page, his own. Whoever wrote this, Watson murmured, knew you'd come. Holmes didn't answer. He flipped back several pages, his gloved fingers moving delicately, as if afraid to disrupt the fragile balance of time held within the paper. The handwriting was familiar, neatly angular, economical in motion. It reminded him of someone. Not Mycroft. Not Moriarty. No, someone from before all of them. The journal entries were dated 10 years ago, beginning shortly after the fire that consumed Blackridge Abbey. The author referred to themselves only as the Keeper. The first entries were meticulous logs, weather patterns, train timetables, the comings and goings of servants, even fox sightings on the grounds. But gradually, the tone darkened. He returns at dusk. Always from the moor. Never speaks. I think he's seen me now. The portrait was slashed again. The child's face removed entirely. Why would someone do that, unless they feared what it still showed? They've started using the old tunnels again. Holmes paused. Tunnels? Watson raised an eyebrow. There are tunnels beneath this estate? Every estate of power has secrets beneath it. In this part of the country, they called them escape routes. Smugglers' lanes, old priest holes. But sometimes, they were built not for escape, but for return. Holmes stood abruptly and walked to the far wall. There, a faded tapestry hung, a hunting scene with hounds and riders. Without ceremony, he yanked it down. Behind it, a narrow door. Oak, scorched at the hinges. A rusted handle. Watson exhaled. Still locked? Holmes tested it. It gave a low groan, but opened. Beyond the door was a staircase descending into earth. Stone walls, slick with age and moisture, and the smell of damp moss and secrets. Holmes lit a match. The flame danced nervously. There's no dust here, he said quietly. It's been used. Watson followed, the journal tucked under his arm. Why keep records in a journal if you're hiding underground? Because the writer wasn't hiding, Holmes replied. They were observing. The tunnel grew colder as they descended, winding and uneven. Soon, the flicker of a lantern became visible in the distance. They approached slowly. In the flickering light, a man stood with his back turned, tall, pale-haired, cloaked in a gray coat that looked decades out of place. He seemed to be adjusting something on the wall, a collection of pinned notes, string, and photographs. Holmes stepped into the light. "Daniel," he said, almost gently. "You've grown." The figure turned. It was him. Older, yes. But unmistakable. Daniel Belmore. The boy who vanished. Now a man who had never truly left. Watson gasped. "You're alive." Daniel's eyes were calm. Haunted. Intelligent. "I never died," he said. "But someone wanted the world to believe I had." He turned back to the wall and pointed. And there, arranged in maddening precision, was a map of Blackridge Abbey, and the faces of everyone who had entered since the fire. Including Holmes. "I called you here," Daniel said softly. "Not because I needed you to solve the case." He looked over his shoulder, something colder creeping into his voice. "But because I needed you to finish what you started." Chapter 6, The Fire Beneath the Ashes. Holmes stood still, his silhouette painted in shadow against the flickering lantern light, while Daniel Belmore's words echoed through the narrow tunnel chamber. "I needed you to finish what you started." Watson felt the air thicken. "Holmes, what does he mean by that?" Holmes didn't answer right away. His gaze remained locked on Daniel's face, searching, dissecting, reliving. Daniel turned back to the board on the stone wall, where old, yellowing photographs were pinned with surgical care. Strings of red twine crossed one another like veins, linking faces, events, locations. At the very center, one name. Victor Trevelyan. Holmes's jaw tensed. Trevelyan was presumed dead in the fire, Watson said slowly, recognizing the name. A financier, tied to half of London's old estates. Daniel gave a hollow smile. "Presumed by whom?" "The same men who said I was dead." He traced the red string with a pale finger. "The fire wasn't an accident. And Victor Trevelyan wasn't a victim. He was the architect." Holmes stepped closer, scanning the network of clues. Trevelyan forged documents, displaced heirs, erased lines of inheritance. He turned Blackridge Abbey into a vault for secrets that were never his. But when his partners turned on him, he burned it down, Daniel finished. "And made it look like I perished inside." Watson's voice was tight. "But why frame a child? Why fake your death?" Daniel looked directly at Holmes. "Because I knew too much." A long silence followed. Holmes turned to Watson, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought this case was about a disappearance. But it was about erasure." Watson frowned. "You mean?" Trevelyan's empire depended on silence. He needed to erase Daniel to keep control of Blackridge's buried records, documents that revealed debts, betrayals, even murders, going back generations. But there was someone else who helped him. Someone who knew the tunnels. Someone who signed the false death certificate. Holmes pointed to a corner of the board. There, almost hidden, was a single paper. A medical certificate. A signature at the bottom. Watson stepped forward and gasped. "No, that's Mycroft Holmes," Daniel said calmly. The name fell like a hammer against the cold stone walls. Holmes didn't move. "My brother," he said, voice hollow. Watson turned to Holmes. "Surely not. Mycroft, he's Whitehall's mind. He moves ministers like chess pieces, but—" Daniel cut in, quiet but firm. "Mycroft didn't start the fire. But he made sure the ashes stayed cold." Holmes stared at the document in silence. Then, finally, "And what do you want from me now?" Daniel looked at him, eyes full of old pain. "Expose it. All of it. You're the only one they'll believe. You're the man they made famous because of this case. Let it be the one that shatters the myth. He stepped forward and placed the journal in Holmes's hand. The keeper's record. Every lie. Every truth. My life, and yours. Holmes swallowed hard. For the first time in years, Watson saw something rare in his old friend's expression, not calculation, not curiosity, but doubt. Above them, a rumble shook the walls. Dust fell from the ceiling. Watson looked up. What was that? Daniel turned, eyes sharp. They know you're here. The lantern flickered. Somewhere in the tunnel behind them, footsteps echoed, measured, deliberate, approaching. Holmes tucked the journal into his coat. Then we don't have long, he said grimly. And the truth has waited long enough. Chapter 7, The Man Behind the Curtain. They emerged from the underground tunnel through a hidden stairwell in an abandoned wing of the old Parliament archives, the city's heartbeat pounding above them. Dust clung to their coats and the damp air still clung to their lungs, but neither Holmes nor Watson spoke as they stepped into the weak morning light. Holmes held the leather-bound journal tightly, its weight far heavier than paper and ink alone. It was a map of corruption, a path through decades of manipulation, blackmail, and inheritance wiped clean by fire and forgery. And somewhere at the center of it all, Mycroft. Watson kept close beside him. We're being watched. Holmes gave a slight nod. Since Blackthorn Station. Watson's hand went to his coat pocket, brushing against the small revolver. Then what now? Holmes turned down a narrow street that led toward Pall Mall, the heart of government. Now we go to the man behind the curtain. Inside Whitehall. The halls of the Foreign Office were unusually quiet that morning. Cool light filtered in through tall windows as high-ranking officials bustled past in whispers. Holmes and Watson were stopped once, then twice, but never denied. Word had clearly preceded them. And then the door opened, as though it had been expecting them. Mycroft Holmes sat behind an immense walnut desk, his fingers steepled. He looked up with calm eyes that did not flicker with surprise, only anticipation. Sherlock, he said coolly. How nostalgic of you to visit uninvited. Holmes entered without pause. I have questions. You have answers. Let's not pretend otherwise. Mycroft gestured to the two chairs before him. Tea? Watson declined with a terse shake of the head. Holmes remained standing. I've found Daniel Belmore, Holmes began. Have you? Mycroft said, with impeccable detachment. Then it seems the dead no longer stay buried. Watson frowned. You knew. Mycroft offered a faint smile. I knew he survived the fire. I ensured he stayed forgotten. Holmes's voice sharpened. Why? Mycroft's tone was unhurried. Because sometimes silence preserves more than truth destroys. He stood now, walking to the tall window behind him. Trevelyan was a puppet. The real danger was what he knew, about certain titles of nobility, secret investments in colonial conflicts, backdoor dealings that could have collapsed the crown's integrity. Holmes stepped forward. You forged a death certificate. You covered for a criminal. I covered for a nation, Mycroft said coldly. Watson bristled. At the cost of a child's life. Mycroft turned. And that child lives because of what I buried. There was silence. Then Holmes reached into his coat and placed the journal on the desk. The truth will not stay in the dark. Mycroft didn't touch the book. And what do you intend to do, Sherlock? Publish it? Become the man who toppled lords and barons? The detective who unmade his own family's name? Holmes met his gaze evenly. I intend to be the man who never looked away. A long pause. Mycroft's voice softened. You'll become famous. Revered. But not for the reason you believe. The truth will never see daylight, Sherlock. Only the legend will remain. Watson frowned. What do you mean? Mycroft returned to his seat. You'll be praised for solving the Blackridge case, made a hero by the very people you threaten. But the real truths, Daniel, Trevelyan, the families whose fortunes were built on ash, they'll disappear behind smoke once more. Holmes narrowed his eyes. You'd rewrite history? No, Mycroft said, almost sadly. I am history. He reached into a drawer and retrieved a parchment. A declaration from the Crown. Blackridge's lands will be restored to Daniel Belmore, under an alias. You will receive credit for solving a long-lost mystery. Justice, in a form that the public can consume. Holmes stared at the paper. Then, with a bitter chuckle, he turned away. And so the case that made me famous will be the one I never truly solved. Mycroft didn't deny it. Watson placed a hand on Holmes's shoulder. Then let it be our truth, Holmes. Between us and the ones it matters to. Holmes nodded slowly. And as they left the office, Watson glanced back at the older Holmes, still seated in silence. A ghost in the machinery. Chapter 8, A Truth Buried in Applause. The streets of London were drenched in celebration. Newspapers flew from every corner shop, headlines screaming with praise. Sherlock Holmes cracks the Blackridge mystery. The young heir returns after decades missing. Detective Holmes saves the Crown from century-old scandal. But inside 221B Baker Street, the fire burned low, and the room was heavy with a different kind of smoke, the silence that follows compromise. Holmes stood at the window, the day's paper in hand, unread. Watson entered with 2 cups of tea, setting one beside the detective. They've made you a hero, Watson said, with half a smile. Holmes didn't turn around. They made a myth. Watson, Saturday, it was still your work that brought Daniel home. To a new identity. A falsified title. He's been renamed, relocated, and rewritten. Watson paused, then nodded. Yes. But he's safe. Free. Holmes finally turned from the window. His face was unreadable. I found the truth, he said slowly, and no one will ever know it. Watson met his eyes. I will. Holmes sat down beside the fire. And yet, the official version shall stand, Daniel Belmore was simply lost, and I, somehow, uncovered him. No mention of Mycroft. No mention of Trevelyan's crimes. No record of Blackthorne's ledger or the underground tunnel. Watson stirred his tea. You've become a symbol, Holmes. And symbols are rarely truthful. They're useful. Holmes chuckled. A bitter kind of immortality. Later that evening, there was a knock on the door. It was Lestrade, a congratulatory grin on his face. Holmes. You're being nominated for a royal commendation. The papers want interviews. Scotland Yard wants to frame the case as a collaboration. The Queen herself may write a letter. Holmes merely gestured for him to sit. Do what you must. The world has already written its version. Lestrade frowned. That's unlike you. Holmes gave a dry smile. Is it? Perhaps you never knew me. Across town, in a small countryside estate funded by a private trust, Daniel Belmore sat in his new study. A dog rested at his feet, a portrait of his father hung over the fireplace, one without the shadow of guilt painted into his eyes. He was safe. Anonymous. Alive. And in his drawer lay a sealed envelope with Sherlock Holmes's handwriting. History forgets, but I do not. S.H. Back at Baker Street, Watson closed his notebook. "What will you do now?" he asked. Holmes leaned back in his chair, eyes half closed. "The usual," he said. "Wait for a case that cannot be silenced." Watson smiled faintly. "And if it never comes?" Holmes's voice was soft. "Then I will carry this one. Quietly. As my own unfinished truth." Outside, bells rang in honor of a victory. Inside, a man sat by the fire, not triumphant, but thoughtful. Famous, yes. But never satisfied. Chapter 9, The One Case Left Untouched. Weeks passed. The limelight faded, the interviews stopped, and London moved on, as it always did. The case was archived in Scotland Yard's vault under a gold-embossed folder labeled, "Solved with Distinction, Sherlock Holmes." And yet, in the quiet of Baker Street, a storm still lingered. Holmes had not taken another case since Blackridge. His violin gathered dust. The firewood burned slower. The evenings were quieter, longer. Even Watson had noticed, Holmes was working less like a man of intellect and more like a man trying to forget. But forgetting was not in his nature. One drizzly afternoon, Watson returned from his clinic to find Holmes seated at the table, a document spread before him. It was old, frayed at the corners, smudged with ink and ash. Watson sat down. "Is that?" Holmes nodded. "The real file? The one Mycroft buried?" "Yes." Holmes tapped a paragraph with a long finger. "Look here. The estate's books show large payments made from the Belmore family account. But the recipient was not Daniel's caretaker. It was someone else." Watson leaned closer. "L.D. Trevelyan. The very man you believed orchestrated the disappearance." "Precisely. But no one ever questioned it." "Why?" Watson frowned. "Because they didn't want to know. Because to expose Trevelyan would have meant undoing too much power, too much lineage, too many names." Holmes looked up. "And so they applauded me, so I would stay quiet." That night, Holmes took a walk through Whitehall. He passed the grand halls of Parliament, the marble steps of ministries, and the shadowed alleyways where secrets drift like fog. He stopped at a discreet iron gate, one only few knew existed. There stood a man in a long coat and hat, waiting. "Mycroft." "You shouldn't be here," Mycroft said softly, not with threat, but with fatigue. "I needed to know," Holmes replied. "If burying that truth was your choice." Mycroft looked away. "It was necessary." "For whom?" "For the country. For stability. For a family that's already paid too high a price." Holmes's voice was cold. "And for your own conscience?" Mycroft met his brother's gaze. "You once said logic was everything. And logically, this was the only way. We preserved Daniel. We ended Trevelyan's reach. We allowed the world to believe what it wanted." Holmes took a breath. "And I was made the hero of a lie." Mycroft sighed. "You were always going to be famous, Sherlock. We merely chose the story." Back at Baker Street, Holmes wrote a letter. He didn't seal it. He didn't send it. He folded it and tucked it behind the copy of the Times that heralded his name in gold. Watson found him the next morning still awake. "You didn't sleep?" "No." "Why?" Holmes looked out the window. "Because somewhere out there, another Daniel may be waiting. Another case, another truth, that no one wants solved." Watson nodded, then reached for the teapot. "Then let's make sure the next one," he said quietly, doesn't end the same way. Holmes looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in weeks, gave the smallest of smiles. Agreed. Chapter 10, A Legend Cast in Shadow. The years went on. The case of Daniel Belmore became legend, retold in newspapers, discussed in lecture halls, dramatized in stage plays across London. It was the story that made Sherlock Holmes a household name. A triumphant tale of deduction, genius, and justice. But the truth, like so many things in Holmes' world, remained sealed beneath the surface. Holmes never spoke of the case again in public. When asked in interviews, he offered the same sharp but vague answers. A child returned. A villain caught. Justice was served. And yet, Watson noticed the glances. The way Holmes's eyes drifted when the name Belmore was mentioned. The way his hand sometimes hovered near the old folder tucked at the back of the bookshelf, never opened, never destroyed. To the world, the mystery was resolved. To Sherlock Holmes, it never truly ended. It wasn't until years later, on a snowy night in December, that Watson finally found the letter. He had been clearing Holmes's things after the great detective had gone into early retirement. Among the papers, cases, and dusty violin strings was a folded parchment, yellowed at the edges. In Holmes's unmistakable script, it read: "To whoever reads this. I did not solve the case. I found the right pieces, yes. And I assembled them neatly for the world to see. But behind the curtain, the real game was played without me. Mycroft, Whitehall, the family, I merely played the part they handed me. And perhaps that's why this case haunts me. Because it was never mine to solve. S.H." Watson tucked the letter back into the file. He stared out the window of Baker Street, watching as fog rolled through the city like a memory trying to return. Sherlock Holmes had become the face of perfect deduction, the voice of reason, the guardian of truth. And yet, the case that made him a legend was the one case he could never truly claim. It wasn't a failure of intellect. It was something more haunting, a victory built on silence. And so, the case of Daniel Belmore faded into time. Celebrated in stories. Forgotten in truth. A brilliant light cast by a deeper shadow. But somewhere, deep in the heart of London, in a quiet flat on Baker Street, the truth still waited, in the silence between violin notes, in the corners of old casebooks, in the eyes of the man who knew too much, but chose to say nothing. Thank you for joining us tonight. Some mysteries define us. Others, we carry in silence. And so I ask you, would you rather be remembered for a lie that brought glory, or a truth that no one ever believed? Let me know in the comments section.